Hello and welcome everyone at the Tennessee Environmental Council's webinar on World Bee Day. My name is Monica Pretz, and I would like to invite you to this webinar and also introduce our panelists. First of all, Bryn Beecham, who is my right-hand side at all the time at events and webinars. And she is our field event coordinator, and she's helping me a lot with native wildflowers. And but most importantly, I would like to invite you to this webinar to learn more from Laurie Hamon, conservation biologist, about bumblebees. Very quickly about Laurie. Laurie is the project manager for the Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas, a community science project to track and conserve bumblebees in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee. She earned her PhD at the North Carolina State University, where she conducted her thesis on the pollination ecology of the Venus flytraps. She has conducted survey work for multiple rare insect species and investigated insect communities in urban pollinator gardens. Laurie has previous experience coordinating a community science project to monitor butterflies at biological reserves in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I want to mention that I met Laurie last year when we met in Knoxville, and when I joined the Bumblebee Atlas and learned how to monitor and capture and identify bumblebees, and it was an amazing event. And I invite all of you not only to join this webinar, but maybe later on check out and join the Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas and help Laurie's work, and we can learn more about bumblebee species. So with all this, I give you the word, and please share your screen, and welcome to our webinar.
Thanks so much, Monica, and thank you so much for having me. Hopefully you're able to see my first slide here. Is that the case, Monica?
Yes, I just turned off my video so we can hopefully see everything. I hope everyone is.
Yeah, I did want to add one more thing. If you guys have any questions during the webinar, you can put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will try to answer them all by the end of the webinar.
Cool, thank you. Monica introduced me, but hello, I'm Laurie Hamon. I work for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, which is a private nonprofit based out of Portland, Oregon. I'm our only Southeastern employee currently, but it's a joy to be representing Xerces here in the Southeast. Just want to have you see it spelled out because it's a confusing name that starts with an X. I've heard it pronounced exercise before. But again, we're a private nonprofit. Our main goal is protecting invertebrates, anything without a backbone, usually insects and mussels. And we do this a number of different ways, both through applied science, including the community science that I'll mention a little bit today, advocacy work, consultation, things like that. So I'll just introduce the concept of pollination because that is sort of a main driver for maybe why we as humans might be interested in bumblebees. But the nitty-gritty of pollination is just the movement of pollen from the male part of a flower to the female part of a flower. So any animal that does this is a pollinator. And these animals might be doing this because they're seeking the pollen and the nectar itself as a food source. They might also be seeking other resources from the flower like scents or resins. Sometimes pollinators will pollinate a flower just because it's a nice warm place to hang out, and they might hang out there for a day and then hang out in another flower for a day, and thereby still affect pollination. And since it's such a broad definition, pollinators are hugely diverse. It includes your classic butterflies, bees, but also wasps, flies, beetles, up to vertebrates like birds and bats. And then recently there was a study that found potentially a certain frog to be an important pollinator of a certain tropical species, which is really fascinating. So they're extraordinarily diverse. And animal pollinators are responsible for the pollination of over 85% of flowering plant species globally. So most flowering plants rely, at least in part, on an animal to get their pollen from point A to point B for reproduction. And obviously, this is hugely important for humans as well as in the environment. If pollinators disappeared tomorrow, sometimes the term I hear people use sometimes is like 1 out of every 3 bites of food is from a pollinator, which is not my favorite factoid because I think it flattens the picture a little bit. Most of our calories as humans come from wind-pollinated plants like rice and wheat. But it is true that if pollinators disappeared tomorrow, our diets would become way less diverse and we would be pretty malnourished for certain vitamins. Certain products would become way, way more expensive or scarce without pollinators, including some of the examples I've shown on the left here: peaches, blackberries, blueberries, cranberries, almonds. These things are hugely dependent on pollinators to actually produce a product. And then some fruits would disappear pretty much entirely. They cannot reproduce without pollinators. So watermelons, Halloween would look very different without pumpkins. A huge one for me is cocoa or chocolate, vanilla. I believe also coffee would disappear nearly entirely. So without pollinators, our diets would be pretty bland. I mentioned earlier that pollinators are hugely diverse, but most of the time when we are looking at a pollinator or thinking about pollinators, we're pretty focused on bees. And there's a reason for this, and that's because bees are flower experts. They have co-evolved alongside flowers. Bees and flowers sort of made each other more diverse. Bees are only pollinators that consume things from flowers throughout their entire life cycle. So both as young larvae and as adults. So they're specialized to feed on flowers, which makes them especially efficient pollinators. I think that when most people think about bees, they think of a lot of the things that are typically associated with honeybees. I've encountered this issue because when I start studying a different organism, I usually like to look it up on Etsy or look out for it in gift shops and see what I can get associated with that organism. And I noticed that when I started looking at bumblebee things, a lot of the sort of symbols or motifs that were on bumblebee products were actually things that are honeybee things. So hexagonal cells, honey, that golden honey, living in huge, massive colonies with tens of thousands of individuals. These are honeybee things. And I think this is worth pointing out because in North America and in Tennessee, we have just the one species of honeybee, and it's not native to our region. It was introduced with the Europeans in about the 1600s. And something interesting, I think, is that amongst bee species in North America, honeybees are kind of an unusual case in how they live their life. If we look at the diversity of how bumblebees or how bees nest, it's not just how honeybees do it, which is combs in cavities. Most of our native bee species are soil nesting. So over 70% of our bee species are soil nesting. Some of them nest in wood, if you're familiar with carpenter bees. Many of our bee species are nesting in hollow or pithy stems. And those cavity nesters, so honeybees, but also bumblebees, make up just fewer than 1% of our native bee species. Another thing that's unusual about honeybees is that they're extremely social. They're real experts at living in essentially a society with a division of labor between a queen who focuses on producing eggs and workers that are actually foraging for nectar and drones. Whereas actually the vast majority of our native bee species live solitary lives where it's a single female laying eggs, looking after those eggs, and providing for those eggs. Bees exist on a kind of spectrum from this mostly solitary lifestyle to society experts like honeybees. And bumblebees fall somewhere along the spectrum. Bumblebees do live in a colony, but it's a lot messier and disorganized than a honeybee colony. And I'll talk about that more specifically in a bit. I also think it's worth pointing out that only a few bees globally produce honey, at least honey the way we think about it. This includes the handful of honeybee species that occur around the world, and also on the slide here you can see stingless bees, which are cultivated to produce honey, especially by indigenous cultures in Central and South America. But honey as we know it, as like a sort of processed product that is created by the bees, is something that's unique to pretty much only a handful of species. And I point this out just because we're going to start at bees broadly, and we're going to narrow in on where bumblebees fit in on this, that bees are a hugely diverse group of organisms. Worldwide, there are over 20,000 species of bee. In North America, we have over 5,000 species. And then here in the Southeast, including in Tennessee, we have some 560 odd species. And this slide is just showing you some of the diversity that occurs within bees. So let's talk about bumblebees specifically and how they fit into the whole wider realm of bees. In North America, we have some 47 species of bumblebee, depending on who you ask. Here in the Southeast, we have at least 15 species of bumblebee. And this map on the right is showing sort of where our highest diversity of bumblebee species is concentrated. The highest bumblebee diversity occurs in sort of the Pacific Northwest, California, and the Rockies. And so we're kind of tailing behind the diversity here in the Southeast, but what you may notice is our highest diversity is in the mountains. Something interesting about bumblebees is that they like it mountainous and they like it temperate, so they do really well in cooler environments. So most of our bumblebee species here in the Southeast you're going to find in the mountains. And something that is interesting about bumblebees as a group, and why we might be focusing on them as a group of organisms, is that they're especially great pollinators for a few different reasons. And I'm just going to briefly talk about these reasons. So first off, bumblebees have an interesting physiology, an interesting body. They are capable of something we call muscular thermogenesis, which is when they vibrate their wing muscles to actually raise their own body temperatures. And this allows them to be active in cooler temperatures compared to other pollinating insects. So say early in the year or early in the day or at higher elevations, bumblebees are able to be active and pollinating in pretty cool temperatures compared to a lot of insects. Another thing about bumblebees as a group that makes them effective pollinators is that they have variable tongue lengths. So bumblebees have tongue lengths that vary from like 8 to about 13 millimeters between species. And what this allows them to do is that these different species with these different tongue lengths can therefore pollinate a wide diversity of plants, from flowers with short flowers, which might be more effective for shorter tongue bumblebees, to long flowers that long tongue bumblebees are able to feed from. So as a group, bumblebees can feed and pollinate a wide variety of flowers. And then finally, bumblebees are effective pollinators literally because they're big and bumbling. And also they're capable of something called buzz pollination. And buzz pollination is when the bee essentially grabs the anther, or that male part of the flower, and she vibrates her wing muscles and shakes out more pollen from that anther like it was a maraca than without having buzz pollinated it. And there are a bunch of plant species that really benefit from buzz pollination, including some that we value as humans. For example, tomatoes, blueberries, cranberries. These are all species that really benefit from being buzz pollinated. And sometimes actually farmers will bring in commercial bumblebees to buzz pollinate their crop because it produces a better and higher yield of a crop. Beyond what makes them effective pollinators, I think bumblebees are just fascinating as a group. For what we can learn about them for animal cognition, they've recently become more common as a model for understanding insect behavior. You may be familiar with this study. This came out a couple of years ago, but essentially these researchers gave bumblebees the opportunity to move through a space without wooden balls and a space with wooden balls. And bumblebees seem to disproportionately choose to move through a space with wooden balls specifically so they could do this for seemingly no reason other than to play, which really opens up some questions about how insects think and move through the world. Another study I really like was, hopefully you'll be able to see this video of a bumblebee engaging in some pretty basic tool usage, but she's tugging on a rope here to make a disc available so she can reach this nectar reward. And researchers have found that bumblebees are actually pretty good at, one, doing the sort of basic tool usage, and two, watching other bumblebees do this behavior and then learning how to do it from watching other bumblebees. So we can learn a lot about how animals think from bumblebees as a system, I think. I was going to show you it again. That's fine by me. Okay, so that's a lot about why we might be interested in bumblebees as a group. They're great pollinators. They're fascinating to learn about how they think. I'm going to talk about how they live in the wild and what it actually looks like. So I mentioned earlier that bumblebees are social. They're not quite as advanced as honeybees in terms of sociality. Most species of bumblebee live in social colonies that are founded by a single queen, and these colonies last only one season. So if you're familiar with an annual versus a perennial plant, where perennial plants will last year after year and an annual plant will only last a single growing season, you can kind of think of honeybees as a perennial plant occurring over multiple years, whereas bumblebees are annual. They only last that one growing season. And like a lot of other insects, they go through a life cycle that includes these 4 stages: egg, larva, pupa, and adult. Their colonies are small compared to honeybees, which can have, tens of thousands of individuals. But bumblebee colonies in our region are usually several hundred individuals. But as a group, they can be as few as 25 to over 1,000 individuals in a single hive. And bumblebees love sort of any sort of messy cavity where they can fill it with their comb and their structures. So in our area, underground is pretty common, especially in abandoned rodent burrows, in bunchy grasses, sometimes at the ground level, like above ground. Unmowed areas, brush piles, rock walls, people find them above ground in their bird boxes, just any sort of cavity that they can slot into and fill with their structures. This is a closer look at what it actually looks like inside a bumblebee nest. It's pretty messy, it's pretty jumbled, but there's a few different interesting things going on. So they have these structures, these wax pots. They're literal jars for storing pollen and nectar that they are using to provision their young and their workers. There are clumps of pollen that they lay their eggs on, and these eggs then feed on that pollen and develop from larvae to pupae to adults. There are a few smaller individuals crawling around tending to the brood and those wax pots there, and then there's a bigger individual, and that's the queen there on the right. This is from a nest that was moved from a well house, hence why it is surrounded by pink fuzzy insulation fibers. Not necessarily a recommended place for bees to live, but just explaining why this is surrounded by pink fluff. So if we think of, I mentioned, this is a species or a group of animals that lasts only a single year. So what happens through the course of that year? So this graphic is sort of, if you can imagine, on the left there, starting in the winter, progressing through the spring and summer, and then into the fall and the winter on the right, sort of illustrating a single year. So what does that life cycle look like? So in the spring, the queens will start to emerge, and these queens have spent the winter underground or under leaf litter hibernating. So she will emerge in the spring, and then she will spend a couple weeks searching for a location to start her nest. When she finds that location, she will provision that nest site with a clump of pollen on which she will lay her first batch of eggs. And when that first batch of eggs grows up into adults, those adults now become the workers. They take over the duties of collecting pollen and nectar and looking after young, and the queen switches her focus to just producing eggs. And all these workers, by the way, are female. And then later in the season, the nest will start to produce reproductive individuals. So these are males and new queens, and these individuals will mate outside of the nest. And then those newly mated queens will fatten up, forage, and then find a place underground or under the leaf litter to spend the winter. And the previous queen, her nest mates, and all those males will die, and those newly mated queens are the only ones that will make it to the next year to start the cycle over again. I mentioned earlier that most bumblebees live in social colonies started by a single queen. There are always exceptions to the rule in nature. We have the cuckoo bumblebees, and if you're familiar with cuckoo birds, these function much the same way. So we have 3 species of cuckoo bumblebees here in the Southeast. And the way these work is that a female cuckoo bumblebee will actually invade the nest of a regular bee. She will kill or usurp the queen of that nest and then force the workers of that nest to actually raise her own young. Pretty fascinating system. And to help them do this, cuckoo bumblebees are kind of, to me, it looks like they're kind of built like bulldogs. They have these really thick heads. And they have powerful stingers that help defend themselves when they're doing this overthrowing. So really fascinating stuff. So I ran through some of what we know about the ecology of bumblebees in the wild, but surprisingly, given how frequently we see bumblebees in our gardens and natural areas, there is a ton that we don't know about bumblebees. We have little information about where species are struggling, where they're thriving, and why, which species prefer which habitats, what flowers they're feeding on. What these queens and males are doing outside of the nest, and then they're especially big unknowns for what overwintering queens are doing, where they like to overwinter, and what happens in the nest. And to just show you an example, this is a very recent study that found, after a mishap in the lab, where I guess they accidentally flooded some samples of overwintering queens, they found that overwintering queens can survive flooding apparently just fine. So what they did is they submerged some overwintering queens for upwards of 7 days, and those submerged queens went right back to overwintering and survived, as well as individuals that were left alone, which can point to potentially how well these queens can survive flooding events in the wild. You can imagine if you're spending the winter underground, you might get flooded every once in a while. So we've only just recently discovered that, yes, these overwintering queens seem to survive flooding just fine, which is really cool. I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit of a bummer, which is what threats bumblebees are facing as a group, and some of the ongoing conservation efforts and what we can do as individuals and as a society for bumblebees. So there was an assessment that was done some 10 years ago now, where a group of bumblebee experts wanted to know what bumblebee species globally are declining and facing extinction. And so the main thing you need to focus on from this map are these little pie charts where the warm colors, the red, orange, and yellow, represent the proportion of bumblebee species in that area that are threatened under the IUCN Red List, so critically endangered, endangered, or vulnerable. And in North America, it's about a quarter of our bumblebee species are facing some degree of extinction risk, are considered threatened in some capacity, which is a good chunk of them. You might also notice that there is a chunk of that pie chart for North America that is kind of that bluish purple color. And those are the species that were considered data deficient by this assessment. That means these experts didn't have enough data to say yay or nay as to whether these bumblebees are doing well or doing poorly. It was 5 species. So that's 10% of our bumblebee species where they just didn't have enough data to know whether they're doing well or not, which is quite a few of them. if we take a look at what's going on here in the Southeast, this is, you don't need to memorize all these names. This is just giving you a visual for what species we have or historically had in the Southeast. We have roughly maybe 15 to 17, but every bee here that has an H next to it is a species of bumblebee that hasn't been seen in our region for several decades. So that's why I say give or take maybe 15 to 17 species. And then all the species that I've outlined in red here are in decline and are considered threatened under the IUCN Red List. So it's over a third of our species that is facing some degree of extinction risk. And it includes the rusty patch bumblebee, which is listed under the endangered species list. It also includes Southern Plains bumblebee and the American bumblebee. Both are currently candidates for listing on the endangered species list, so listed federally. And then that one in the top right, the variable cuckoo bumblebee, hasn't been seen anywhere globally for some 20 years now, so it's thought to maybe be functionally extinct. And why are these bumblebees declining? Well, you may be aware of anxiety over insect declines globally. And what's frustrating is that it's difficult to point to a single smoking gun for why insects are declining. But there are a few things, at least for bumblebees specifically, that there's evidence that they play a role in bumblebee decline. And this includes habitat loss, climate change, diseases and pathogens, and exposure to pesticides. And I'll talk specifically about each of these main threats to bumblebees. So a major threat is exposure to pesticides, especially in the case of pollinators. We're concerned about systemic pesticides or neonicotinoids. When we refer to a systemic insecticide, what we mean is an insecticide that is actually taken up through the roots of the plant and then expressed in its tissues, including through its nectar and pollen, which is a major route of exposure for how pollinators then get exposed to this insecticide. And this series of maps is just showing the increase in the use of a particular systemic insecticide or neonicotinoid called imidacloprid from its introduction into the market in the early 90s, and then its increasing use, especially on agricultural land, in the last several decades. It's really expanded. Another key threat, is habitat loss. So if you look at these habitats, these provide things in certain ways for bumblebees. And on the habitat on the left, that is, a farm, and potentially whatever's blooming there could be blooming for a part of the year and providing some resources for bumblebees. But it's only through one part of the year, not through its whole life cycle. These agricultural areas are also increase the risk of bumblebees being exposed to pesticides. The soil is disturbed, so it's hard to build a nest here. And then on the right, these impervious surfaces or lawns are essentially biodiversity deserts for pollinators and the things that they feed on. And here in the Southeast, we're rapidly growing as an area. So the amount of land being converted to residential and agricultural areas is really changing. Another threat is climate change, which is affecting all species. And when it comes to pollinators, including bumblebees, it's affecting where and when we see pollinators active in the year. On the top there, I believe this is from a preliminary study, but there seems to be some evidence for bumblebees in the West that their range as temperatures warm, there's the southern end of their range is shifting upwards, but they seem to be not very good at shifting northwards in kind with this temperature elevation. So essentially what you get there is a reduction, a shrinking of the area where bumblebees like to live. A similar pattern is occurring on an elevational gradient. So if you have bumblebees on a mountain, at the lower parts of that mountain, as temperatures increase, you might see a shiftward upwards of bumblebees and where they can occur on the landscape. And essentially, as that shifts upward, you end up with these little islands or pockets higher up on the mountain of where bumblebees can live. At a timing, from a perspective of timing, we're seeing shifts in when things occur in the year, when spring starts and when the growing season ends. In general, it seems like pollinators and the flowers they feed on are shifting earlier in the year together alongside each other. But there have been instances where we've seen potentially for some species a mismatch in certain flowering plant species when they're blooming in the year and when their usual pollinators are active, which could have repercussions for both those plants and those pollinators. So this is all an area of continuing active study for how is climate change affecting our bees. And then finally, something that for certain rare species, we know disease plays a role in the decline of certain species. Bumblebees, like many organisms, are threatened by a number of diseases. You don't need to memorize the scientific names on the slide here, but I wanted to show some major players in terms of some of the diseases that we're considering or that we're studying for bumblebees. Many of these affect the gut of the bumblebee and affect its ability to live, to reproduce, to successfully forage, things like that. And what we do know is that diseases can be spread to wild bees from commercial bees. So an example of a commercial bee are honeybees. And this graph on the left is from a study where the authors wanted to find out how diseased bumblebee colonies were that were close to a honeybee hive versus bumblebee colonies that were far away from a honeybee hive. So that gray bar is the number of parasite species that were found in bumblebees living close to a honeybee hive versus those that were living far away. And bumblebees that were found close to the honeybee hive had a higher number of parasite species in their bodies compared to those that were far away. Those that were close also had a significantly higher infection rate from a particular disease, Crothidia bombii, pointing to the potential role of honeybees in actually spreading disease in the ecosystem, passing that on to native bees that are foraging on the same flowers. While we're pointing some fingers at honeybees, it's worth pointing out that honeybees are mega efficient foragers living in hives of tens of thousands of individuals. And a single honeybee hive can potentially have huge impacts on the native bees in the environment where it occurs. So there was a study that actually wanted to estimate in terms of hard numbers how a single honeybee colony competes with native bees on the landscape. And through a series of mathematical formulas and measurements, they estimated that in a given growing season, a healthy honeybee colony can gather as much pollen as is needed to feed 100,000 solitary bee larvae. So that's a single honeybee hive potentially collecting the amount of food that would otherwise provision 100,000 native bees. And all of this is to say, I love honeybees. It's extremely essential for agricultural systems in producing honey and beeswax and other products. But we as Xerces like to emphasize that honeybee keeping is not itself a form of wildlife conservation. And if done improperly, it can actually harm native bees. So we encourage folks to procure honeybees or keep honeybees only if they have lots of flowers around so that the honeybees and the native bees can share, and also to be vigilant about controlling for diseases in their honeybee hives, treating diseases so to minimize the risk of spreading that disease to native bees. The analogy I hear sometimes is if you want to get into bird conservation, you don't necessarily get some backyard chickens. But again, honeybees are fantastic in their own right. They're just worth considering some of the impacts that they have. So the summary of the bummer things, some of the major threats to bumblebees, and these work both in isolation and synergistically with one another. Pesticides, habitat loss, climate change, disease are all things that we can think about how to approach when we're thinking about how to conserve bumblebees in the future. So let's talk about some things that we can do to actually help conserve bumblebees. So there are three main things. Sorry, this is a little fuzzy. if you're thinking especially about your own backyards potentially, or if you have land, how do you manage that land? Three main things to think about for improving bumblebee habitat is providing food sources, providing shelter, and then rethinking how you are controlling for pests on that landscape. So earlier I showed that the bumblebee life cycle it occurs throughout the entire year from when those queens emerge in early spring, and then new queens start hibernation in the fall. So the best thing is to provide food resources that support bumblebees throughout their entire life cycle through that year. So this slide is just giving you examples of a suite of flowers that one could potentially plant in the Southeast that provide bloom throughout the entire bee life cycle and therefore could support it throughout the entire year. This is also available on the Xerces website, but it's just to give an example of some plants. Something interesting or fun about, and I'll talk about the Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas in a bit, but we are really keen to gather information about what native plants are popular with our native bumblebees. And this was our top 10 list for popular native plants for bumblebees last year. So our number one, most of our, the highest proportion of our bumblebees were collected or observed feeding on mountain mints, pygnanthemum, but then goldenrod, sensitive pea, bee balm, smolanthus, that hairy leaf cup, Clethra-alnifolia, Euthymia, Silphium, Joe Pye weeds, which includes Eutrochium, and then fireweeds, Arctides. So I'm really excited about the data that we're already starting to gather about which flowers are favorited by bumblebees. Something to consider if you are choosing plants for making a pollinator garden, say, is that sometimes for certain nurseries, especially these big box nurseries, sometimes plants are treated with neonicotinoids to control pests, and these neonicotinoids can persist in the plant for quite a while, sometimes several months up to a year or years. So it's worth asking at nurseries how they approach pest control. Oftentimes people won't know if you ask them, but even just asking the question might make them more aware of how they're controlling for pests in their nurseries. Another thing to consider is that sometimes plants that are labeled bee safe might not always be labeled bee safe. There was a study not that long ago that sampled, looked at plants that were labeled as pollinator friendly or bee friendly, and tested them for the presence of neonicotinoids and found that quite a proportion of them still had neonicotinoids. So just be aware of labels. They're not necessarily telling you the whole picture. And then finally, many of our sort of horticultural plant varieties are bred mainly for looks and not for providing resources for pollinators. So especially things that are bred to have multiple petals or unusual color morphs, they might be providing very little in terms of pollen and nectar. All that to just bring us to a refrain you've probably heard before, is that when you're considering supporting wildlife, a good rule of thumb is to just focus on native plants. Native plants have co-evolved alongside the native fauna. They can provide pollen, nectar, leaves for moths and butterflies a lot of the time, and also they can allow you to be a little lazier in the garden, potentially reducing your water use and your need for fertilization. So just a good rule of thumb to focus on natives when you're thinking of pollinator gardens. So that's the food resources. We also want to think about providing nesting habitat. This is another opportunity to be lazy in the garden if you want to provide nesting habitat for bumblebees. Bumblebees love it messy. They love old abandoned rodent holes in the ground. They love brushy, bunched up grasses, unmowed areas, brush piles. The queens will overwinter under the leaves, and many other insects overwinter under the leaves. So rather than putting your leaves in a trash bag and throwing them away at the curb, potentially raking them up into a pile elsewhere in your yard and leaving them there is a great way to provide habitat for bumblebees. Oh, I'll also mention that at Xerces, we do have signs that say like pollinator habitat that you can get, so that if your HOA gives you trouble about this mess, maybe you can just point them to the sign and say, I'm doing my bit. Another consideration in your gardens is just rethinking what a beautiful garden actually looks like. And that's a good rule of thumb for as you're approaching pest control. So one might look at this plant and look at these holes punched out of it and think, I have a pest in my garden that I need to deal with. But maybe you could also look at this damage and think, oh, okay, my garden is supporting, in this case, leafcutter bees. And these leafcutter bees punch out these neat little holes and use them to build their nest to raise their babies. So just rethinking the garden less as an aesthetic space and more as a holistic environment supporting many different organisms. I'll mention briefly at the end here, I'll just talk about the Bumblebee Atlas projects. This is another way we can support bumblebee conservation, is we need that data to actually make effective conservation decisions. If you remember that some 10% of our native bumblebees, we don't really know how they're doing, and it makes it tough to actually conserve them. So in 2018, the Xerces Society launched this Bumblebee Atlas project. We started in the Pacific Northwest. We've since spread to 20 states. As of this year, we are officially, technically coast to coast. Tennessee's kind of holding hands with the rest of the project there. And to make these projects possible, we partner with a number of agencies and institutions. And for us in the Southeast, we are partner with the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. So lots of partners to help make these projects possible. And the way these projects work is that we ask participants to receive training, and they can either do that by watching our online training or attending an in-person training, making an account on our data collection page. We ask that they adopt a grid cell or a region of the Southeast. I'll just show you briefly what that means in a little bit. Plan their survey, and then we ask that folks survey at least 2 times within their adopted area and then upload that data to Bumblebee Watch. When we say grid cell, we're trying our best to actually get people to get data away from sort of populated areas. We've got plenty of data from sort of like Atlanta area, Charlotte area. But we really, and that data is valuable, but we would also really love data from away from population centers. So we encourage folks to adopt a grid cell, especially in some of those high priority areas where we have less data or where rare species are likely to occur, and then consider surveying within that grid cell. And what a survey actually looks like is individuals search for bumblebees for about 45 minutes. They catch every bumblebee, or attempt is probably the key word. They attempt to catch every bumblebee that they see. They actually chill the bumblebees on ice, and this allows this cools the bee and stills its movement enough to take scientific quality voucher photographs. And then those bees warm up in about 5 minutes and fly away unharmed. It's a non-lethal survey, so no one gets hurt. And then conduct a habitat survey to see what kind of flowers are in that area and what kind of habitat management is going on where they saw those bees. Every time a different branch of the Bumblebee Atlas project launches, we get a little flurry of new observations of bumblebees in that area. And with that flurry of observations, we get more data about where species are doing well, where they're not doing well, what they're feeding on, what habitats are supporting them, etc. And so for the Southeast, I've alluded to this a little bit, but I'm especially excited for some of our rare species to find out what native plants they seem to be huge fans of. So for the American bumblebee, one of its favorites last year was the mullein foxglove, and then the Southern Plains bumblebee seemed to especially be a fan of sweet pepperbush. And knowing this kind of information can give us insights into what plant species we need to manage for. And with that, I will thank the many Xerces Society supporters and also our collaborators and funders. And I think I've left time for questions.
Thank you so much, Laurie. This was an excellent presentation. Bumblebees are such charming little creatures, aren't they?
Yeah, I
Yes,
agree.
and if I may add to it that the season just started, so if you are interested to learn Laurie's webinars, not just this one, but really about the Bumblebee Atlas is available on YouTube. You can just also join her classes and learn and join the program. This is absolutely the time to do it, season just starting. But if you feel that you are not that brave yet to handle bumblebees, you can also come out to our events because we have 48 pollinator gardens in Middle Tennessee, and I'm doing some surveys. So if you want to tag along and do how it's done, what we do, as you're absolutely welcome. Yeah.
Awesome. So we have a couple questions. One from Anne. We get this question a lot at our volunteer events about volunteers, just the public is curious about carpenter bees because I think that's probably the bee they encounter the most at their house. And Anne asks, what good are carpenter bees?
So carpenter bees are effective pollinators. They're generalist pollinators as well. They pollinate a lot of different plants. I know they're a pain on people's sheds and houses and structures, but they also have a really fascinating life cycle where the queen or the female is provisioning nests and babies in those holes. Sometimes they live somewhat communally. So I know they're a pain, but they are pollinators in their own right and really fascinating animals.
We have one more question from Beverly. Do moles or possums eat the nests of bumblebees?
Yeah, a few, especially mammals, will get into a bumblebee nest and eat them. They have that nectar and pollen in those jars and larvae that are a good protein source. So I'm not sure about moles, but I'm also not very good at knowing my mammals and what they do. But possums for sure, yeah, would get into a bumblebee nest.
Thank you. We have one more question from Lauren. With the impacts on native bees, how can I figure out who to buy honey from? Are there any types of stamps or anything that certain keepers can show they are following the recommended regulations?
That's a great question, and I would think that maybe Xerces probably has a specific publication or article to specifically instruct folks on this. But from my perspective, I would recommend just asking questions. First off, maybe focusing on buying local honey so that you can ask the beekeepers directly how they manage their hives. I think a good sort of what we might call a green flag, a good sign is if your local honeybee keeper knows about native bees and some of the threats facing native bees, and is therefore maybe mindful about how to manage their own honeybee hives. So I think just asking questions from local beekeepers is a good start.
Oh,
Yes, I
wow.
think, sorry, I just
All
wanted to
right,
say
go
that
ahead, Monica.
I just wanted to say, I think you mentioned that one hive can compete to 100,000 native bees. That's mind-blowing. That's mind-blowing because most people have one or two and in small gardens. And the question really, all these, well, just if we think of how many hives are there in small gardens within Nashville, is how much chance native bees and bumblebees have competing for the resources.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
The questions are now rolling in, so we have more than a couple questions. We have a handful. Hillary asks, do we know if or how the populations are affected by cicada broods?
I don't know. I would suspect not very much. Um, uh, they're probably as aware of it as we are, but cicadas aren't foraging on the flowers or necessarily imposing on their life cycle. And bumblebees are mostly visual navigators, so sound isn't necessarily as big a deal. So I would imagine minimal impact, but I could be wrong.
Maybe they're predated less because there's so much extra food out there for other birds and mammals.
That's a good point. There's so much else to focus on with all these cicadas around.
Yeah, I've noticed that they're not eating, the birds aren't eating their normal forage this year because they're probably so stuffed. Gwen asks, are bee hotels good for bumblebees?
So bee hotels are great for cavity or stem nesting bees. So bumblebees are not stem nesting bees. They're mostly ground nesting or cavity nesting bees. So bee hotels are great for other kinds of bees, and really fascinating ways of observing other kinds, solitary bees specifically, directly in your garden.
Okay. Beverly asks, so bumblebees are another good reason to not get rid of all the leaves each fall?
Yes, there are plenty of reasons to, quote, leave the leaves. Lots of insects overwinter underneath them. So I generally recommend that folks like do this according to what is best for their ability or what their HOA will allow. Sometimes this can just mean raking them to a less used corner of your yard or using them as mulch. Yeah, another great reason to leave the leaves. I'll also, if I can address this one about, there are ways of discouraging carpenter bees from returning to a place. So you can wait till the season's over and plug up, if you're being annoyed by carpenter bees, plug up their holes and finish wood and hopefully attempt so that they won't return. So there are ways to hopefully humanely discourage them.
Yeah, I've read that painting the wood, staining it can help. I've also read like there's certain types of oil, like citrus oils that might be um discouraging to carpenter bees, but I think it's worth an effort to try to do that instead of using traps. That makes me sad. And then how do you sign up to work on the survey?
Well, maybe I can pop the pop our website in the chat. Would that work?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Please do that.
And you can follow, it has sort of a brief step-by-step of how you can get involved, but the main thing is just getting trained, signing up for a grid cell, and doing those two surveys. So I'll pop for the Southeast, I'll pop that in the chat. Oh, I'm only able to send it to hosts and panelists. So I'm going to send it to you, Bryn, and maybe you can pass it on.
Oh, okay.
For some reason, it won't let me send to everybody.
Oh yeah, I see that.
Okay, while Brini is fixing that part and sharing it, I would like to have a question. So you were talking about the bumblebee queens a lot, how only the pregnant bumblebee queen survives, the new queen survives for the winter. Is there any studies that indicate how many new queens emerging from a colony? I mean, I know that the sizes of the colonies can vary, but I
Yeah.
wonder how many of.
My loose understanding of how many queens a given hive produces is that, say, if you have a typical hive of several hundred individuals and it's healthy, it'll be several dozen queens.
Okay.
So a good number of individuals.
Okay, because I was wondering, that you have shown data, the new amazing and astonishing data about how they survive flooding and survive being underwater even for 7 days. I read the article and I think it's like 90% of them will survive being in cold and underwater. That's really astonishing. So they definitely adapted to nature. However, I was wondering do you have any examples of any other insect that the whole colony and the whole colony dies except the females? And because I find it evolutionary such a huge risk that only the pregnant females are surviving 6 months of hibernation and the whole colony restarts from a pregnant female, a queen. Is there
Yeah,
any similar? I couldn't find anything.
I believe there are some bees where the overwintering individual are just the females from the previous year. I think, as you mentioned, it's mainly bees overwinter as sort of a late stage larvae over the winter. But yeah, it does seem to be a somewhat risky, a risky way of surviving a winter. Maybe I need to look into that more as well.
And I would like to have another question. I don't know if we have more question, Brian?
Yes, let's.
Okay, let's go with those first.
Yeah, Lauren's asking about bee hotels. Do you recommend them, and what's the best source to see correct sizes for the holes or the cavities?
I've shared a little publication from Xerces about bee hotels, including some suggested ways to build them, which hopefully includes some info about some of the cavity sizes.
Okay.
I think the wisdom is just a variety of hole or cavity sizes to encourage a variety of different bee species to live in that hotel. There's some research that potentially bee hotels are kind of a magnet for predators of bees and parasitoids like wasps. I think my understanding is the jury's still out on that. I personally still encourage bee hotels, but maybe be mindful as to whether they're attracting more predators than they are producing new bees. I think for now, they're still like a great, wonderful way to learn about bees in your habitats and hopefully encourage them to nest. But that is something to keep in mind that people are studying as to whether or not they're just a magnet for predators as well.
Yeah, at TEC, we usually suggest that if you are interested in creating bee hotels, rather go for bee Airbnbs. So let's have more small one instead of one large one. So you reduce the chance of all kind of predators or pathogens spreading within the hotels or bee houses.
I like that. So like multiple little condos scattered around.
Yes,
So yeah.
exactly, exactly. I quickly would like to have another question, maybe that there are several species that are critically endangered or declining. And you already did a whole year of the Tennessee Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas. And for example, have you seen any rusty patch bumblebees, which used to be common, but I wonder if we have anyone noticed, anyone seen them, or maybe the yellow banded that was also.
So the only rare ones observed last year were the American bumblebee, which is still pretty common in the South, and the Southern Plains bumblebee, which is still reasonably common in the coastal plains and West Tennessee. Also, the Fernald cuckoo was observed last year, which isn't necessarily in decline. I think we're not really sure how it's doing. I will say the rusty patch bumblebee has not been observed in Tennessee since 2000, so since for over 2 decades, but it has been seen just over the border in the mountains of Virginia in the last several years. So the thinking is that the rusty patch bumblebee is still in the mountains somewhere in eastern Tennessee or west North Carolina. We just are not looking in the right places, and we need more eyes on the ground, which is why the Bumblebee Atlas is an exciting opportunity. If we could have more folks out there actually keeping an eye out for the rusty patch, maybe we'll see it soon. Who knows?
Yeah, so all of you who signed in for this webinar from Knoxville, that area is closer to you. So if you are interested to join, looking for these bumblebees, that would be awesome, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, we need all the help we can get to help our bumblebees.
Monica, did you have any more questions?
I have one more question, because you were talking about bumblebees, how the tongue lengths can be different, but and they are generalist pollinators, right? And they also have the tendency sometimes, if I read correctly, that they chew through the flowers to reach the pollen. And I've read somewhere that they have seen some kind of rapid evolution of tongue lengths shortening. I wonder if that has anything that you heard of.
That's news to me. I totally believe it. It's a good strategy to cheat and just chew a hole at the bottom of the flower and get the nectar directly. I'd wonder why that evolution would be happening more recently as opposed to
Yeah,
over
it
ecological
was.
time.
Yeah, I think it was because of decline of certain native plant wildflower
Ah,
species that required the long tongue. But I don't know how really scientific it was. So
I'll
I
look
have
into that.
yeah.
Well, I think that was the end of questions from participants. Do you have any more questions, Monica?
I think I will definitely have more questions for Laurie. I will contact her in email, both about the survey to have better at it, and also I will have some further question. But I want to say thank you so much because you delivered and brought us so many new information and up-to-date science, and it was absolutely fascinating. I think I'm just more hooked on bumblebees than I ever was. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hope everyone enjoyed this presentation. And as it is recorded, we will share it with you very soon on our YouTube channel. And please check out our Generate Some Buzz page. You can always look into the seed mixes that Tennessee Environmental Council has. Laurie was sharing some of the native wildflowers that these bumblebees adore and love, and our seed mixes contains many of them. So I would highly recommend to check those out. And then also please check out Laurie's webinars and presentations about the Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas and join her survey. And with that, I thank all of you for joining Tennessee Environmental Council today. And please celebrate the World Bee Day. Yes.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.